This is Hope Incorporated Australia. We engage with citizens and communities to help achieve better, responsible environmental protection and stewardship, locally, nationally and globally. We work from and adjacent to the traditional lands of the Gayabal, Jadawa and Yugara peoples of southeast Queensland, and we acknowledge our deep respect for the inspiring, protective nature stewardship carried out by First Nations communities around the world for thousands of years.
I suppose I'm in the lucky position that I've got a bit of experience. I don't mind doing public talks and I don't mind doing videos and things, and it's great to be able to get the ideas out there, but you've got to do more than that. I think you've got to get your hands dirty and get involved and start to make these systems yourself. So it's about educating, but also about doing. And the best way to do is not to ask permission from people who aren't really that genuine anyway. It's just to go and do it.
Hello and welcome. My name is Andrew Nicholson, host of Imagining 2040 Pathways to Flourishing Futures, a podcast from Hope Incorporated Australia. This series showcases the use of public future vision imagination to explore credible pathways toward helping achieve properly nature protected, climate safer and more socially inclusive and economically fairer futures. Futures that would leave no one behind. On current business-as-usual development trends, it is highly unlikely that those are the sort of futures we're headed for. My guest in this episode, Scot McPhee, trained in Anthropology, Ornithology and Creative Arts, and over time has occupied many roles as an environmental protection advocate, bird enthusiast, writer, filmmaker, performer and podcaster. As with other guests interviewed on the challenges we face to create a well-protected and respected place for nature in our region and nation, Scot is aware of the stark contrast between Australian nature protection regulations which exist on paper and their lack of effectiveness on the ground in preventing the continued destruction of what is left of our vulnerable natural places and species. Along with a growing number of other concerned citizens, Scot believes that we need deep reforms and improvements to our present ways of protecting nature and biodiversity here, because clearly our current business-as-usual approaches to doing the job are not fit for purpose. And without a well-protected, well-connected and community-stewarded place for nature going forward, the health of our natural world and the human health and well-being, which relies so heavily upon it, will almost certainly continue to deteriorate. One of Scot's own nature protection advocacy actions in recent years in this region has been to support calls to local government to take a more assertive stand in managing infrastructure development proposals so as to achieve a better balance between the closely linked needs of our human and more than human natural world communities. So, what if we could achieve such a better balance in the years ahead, and what might it take to reach that goal? These are some of the future vision imagination questions which will help frame this episode. So okay, let's get into it. Welcome, Scot. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast today.
Oh, thank you for inviting me, Andy. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Let's get straight into this conversation. Let's invite you to build on that very short biography I just gave at the beginning of the episode. Can you give us a fuller self-introduction to you and your work, perhaps a short story on how you developed the interests and energy for the work you're doing to support a proper place for nature in this region in 2025?
Yeah, well, you know, I'm reminded of a quote Mark Knopfler gave once when he was asked about his singing, and he just said he just stumbled from one crisis to another. And listening to your run through of the different things I've done, I kind of feel like I've stumbled from one thing to another as well. And I guess it's all driven by passion and, you know, what I feel strongly about. I work now as an ornithologist, and I've had a lifelong love for birds. Why? I can't explain. It's just an innate thing. Some people like this, some people like that. I've just always loved birds. And you know, as a young kid and a teenager, I wanted to be an ornithologist, and I went to boarding school, and that was kind of beaten out of me a little bit. So I guess I took a bit of a more of a path. Honestly, look, I lost self-confidence really, and I'm very happy that I've done a lot of the artistic things that I have. So I've written and directed a lot of plays and some independent films, and I do sketch comedy with a friend as well. And, all of that there, I guess I was trying to find or explore something. It's really like an emotional thing, but it's given me skills to present and to communicate effectively. And I don't know, I guess just as my self-confidence came back, my interest in birds came back. And so I ended up studying ornithology after I'd completed an anthropology degree. And but I very quickly, as soon as I got more actively involved in birding again, I very quickly realised it's not enough just to go out and have a nice day enjoying birds, because when the numbers are crashing all around us, it's pretty selfish just to go and see something that you enjoy, but then not want to do something about it as well. And so it's never been enough for me just to enjoy birds. I want to try and do something for them as well. And any nature interest or desire you have to improve the world, it's holistic. You improve it for one thing, you're improving it for other things. And I've got kids now, and I think of what the world was like when I was just a kid in the 70s, and the Living Planet report from the World Wildlife Fund shows that the vertebrate population species have crashed. They're about 1/3 of what they used to be in 1970, and so the world that I remember doesn't exist anymore. And I might be motivated on the outset by trying to do things for birds, but it's for humanity as well. We're all connected, all part of it. And, that's kind of what's driven me towards the activism in my local area around Toowoomba for the trying to get vegetation management, because we don't have it. And developers bulldoze trees that are 200 or 300 years old. And it's just criminal, in my opinion.
And Scott, thanks so much for that introduction. That particular focus on birds, very interesting. I mean, you're saying, perhaps why have I had that strong interest? I'll just make this point that, it seems going back in time. I mean, this podcast is about looking forward into time, most of it, but back in time, birds always seem to have been a strong representative symbol of the beauty and spirit of the natural world. You think some of these paintings going back to the medieval period and even before, any paintings that, depicted landscapes, there were often birds in there. And there's been quite a bit written about that, as to what, the particular symbolism and representation of birds. But anyway, I mean, the fact is it's a big deal for you, as it is for a lot of people. I mean, bird watchers, bird enthusiasts, there are many, many of you. And look, just for the listeners out there who want to follow up on some of your interests there, we will put a link in our show notes to your website. You've got, I think, a couple of websites, but we'll put links in there so, people can actually perhaps tap into some of those interests. Now, look, Scott, going forward now, as I say, moving, from past time to present time and now looking forward, give us a few early thoughts perhaps on your work going forward. I mean, you've already started to point to some of the problems and issues that we're dealing with in this area here, which are not unique to this area, but this is where we are. And we're talking about that in terms of damage to the natural world. Let's hear a bit more about, an early take from you on how you think that your work might be able to help us get on to better, more flourishing future development pathways that could take us toward better, proper levels of nature protection and regeneration in the years ahead, because that is not what we have at the moment, as you just imply. And also in the firm knowledge that achieving those better nature protections will be an essential contribution in helping us in the total picture of moving towards a climate safer, more socially supportive and fairer economic future, which leaves no one behind. What would you have to say about that?
Well, that's a really big question. And, I think something that a lot of business and economic people miss, and, they like to put out the impression that they're the realistic and the down-to-earth ones and the sensible ones, but they completely miss the point that we all belong to the biosphere, the biological system. There's no economic system, no housing development, no town, no business, no industry that exists outside of a biological system. So the most realistic outlook is that biologists and conservationists have. It's not what economists have. And, they have the myth of eternal growth and they can keep building things. And, the rubber meets the road in my area where we've got lovely big trees, and rather than develop strategically around them, they just bulldoze the lot. So, I guess for me, it started, I couldn't tell you the year, might have been 22 or 23, but a housing development outside Highfields and a tree that the diameter was probably maybe just under 2 metres or around about 2 metres. That got bulldozed. And I just thought, you just can't let this happen and say nothing about it. So I recorded a video next to this stump, put it online, it went viral. And I think that kind of galvanised a lot of responses. I think a lot of people were feeling what I was feeling, but they weren't saying anything about it. And, that then rolled into a community forum, and we had the then deputy mayor, who's now the mayor, come along, and I think half a dozen councillors. And, the one thing I have learned through my agitating locally is when it comes to the powers that be with the council, is the one thing they listen to is votes. And I do actually think there's a fair bit of goodwill in amongst some of those councillors, but they don't want to be the ones sticking their neck out until they know it's safe to. And the more that you can do to agitate the public or to inform the public, so there's a groundswell, and the majority position and the common sense position is for sensible conservation, then there's not going to be a lot of political leaders who lead the way, but once you establish that in the community, then they will follow. But it's hard to do that. You cop a lot of flack, and you've got to have a bit of a strategy in mind on how to deal with that. I think I'm pretty good with that online now. I know when there's no point in getting in touch with, arguing a point out with people, you do get a lot of abuse, but you just got to let that go. Basically, there's a bigger picture that you're chasing, and it's not winning an argument online or getting upset by what people say online. So you're going to cop that. And, I get people recognise me, particularly north of Toowoomba, when I go to the shops and things like that. And most of the time it's actually quite positive. But sometimes people just stare at you. They stand still and they just stare. And it's a little bit unnerving because you don't really know what's going on in their mind. So you've got to, and I've only ever had one threat, which was delivered online, and his threats go wasn't that bad really, but it was stay away from me or I'll beat you up. Basically, was what he was implying. But if you believe in what you're doing, then you don't get thrown off by those things. You find a way to deal with it, to manage it, and you just keep doing what you're doing. And so that's what I've been doing. And the land clearing situation and the attempt to get vegetation management into our local government laws is front and centre of the agenda here at the moment. So it's been quite successful in that regard. But at the end of the day, and although democracy is better than all the other systems, it's still not perfect by a long shot. And we're still waiting. It's going to be another few years now until we get these reforms in. It's a very slow-moving beast, and the amount of damage that can happen in the meantime is huge. But you've just got to believe in what you're doing, and then just keep doing it, and eventually the groundswell will change.
Thanks so much for that. There's so much in that commentary there you've just given. I mean, just picking out a few things there, the position of any activist, the position of anyone challenging the status quo, the business as usual that's going on in any field, whether it's, development proposals, whether it's the economy, whether it's in politics generally, always there's going to be pushback and there's resistance to. It's basically a link to that psychology of fear of change or whatever it might be. But you're pointing to this, and also you're pointing to the effect that social media has had on enabling, people to criticise others without any comeback, without any consequence, nothing that they would do in face-to-face, all of that stuff. And I mean, there are some heartening moves to, I think, rein in some of the worst effects of social media, scuttlebutt commentary and stuff like that. But also, pointing to this very difficult process of achieving social change, with systems that have been in place, even though they're destructive or unhelpful or negative systems have been in place for so long, they've become the de facto default position. Very hard to change that. But thank you so much for giving us a snapshot of your personal journey, and you're still on it, obviously, past, present, and possible future. It gives us a clear sense of your passion, your personal goals, what you want to achieve. As we move into the next 15 years or so. Let's stay with that and move outside of the box of, the difficulties being down in the weeds, no pun intended here, of challenging the status quo, and use our imaginations to actually think about a better 2040 where we actually achieve all of those things that you're looking to, and not just yourself, many, many other members of the public who are concerned about the trend in the destruction of our beautiful nature, including myself. So let's move to the imaginative heart of the episode, where we use future vision imagination to step beyond the business as usual processes that we've just been talking about there, the constraints, the blocks, if you like, to getting to where we want to go, and visualize credible pathways toward flourishing futures, rather than that taken for granted continuation of what we're up to today, failing development trajectories that are destroying nature. The series introduction that I've done covers these contrasting possible development paths, the better future and the failing future, and the value of activating future vision imagination in thinking about them. So if you haven't listened to that episode yet, perhaps check that out. So, okay, Scott, for you and our listeners out there, let's get into this exercise now and imagine that you have a time travel device. People out there listening to this can't see, but you are in a vehicle of sorts anyway, so I suppose you could be in a... It's a very compact device, but it has amazing capabilities and is now taking you forward into the long-term future, which, as I understand it, is actually defined as 15 years from now. But it's taking you to 2040. And upon immediate arrival there, you can already sense that this isn't a business as usual future. It's a flourishing one. And you can sense, see, hear, and even taste that it is a properly nature protected world with more trees, wildlife, living within thriving natural systems. It's also a cooler, climate safer future where human communities are being better supported by fairer, regenerative, well-being focused economies. No one, human or more than human, is being left behind in this future or these sorts of future. And as you move around or even possibly fly over the landscapes of 2040, your imagination is also helping you reflect on the major shifts that must have occurred between now in 2025 and 2040 across Australia and globally. You realise that a crucial future vision to achieve authentic local government and citizen partnership and collaboration in the authentic stewardship of our precious nature has been achieved. So in our imaginative 2040, such citizen and government nature stewardship partnerships have sprung up regionally in Queensland, across Australia and across the world. And they've started to turn the tide on the past vandalism of nature in the name of development. They're helping create transformative increases in nature and biodiversity levels and associated human well-being. Many more people are benefiting from this improved quality of life, not just a privileged few. So, Scott, I'm sorry to have to prise you out of that time machine and away from that flourishing future. But now imagine you've just returned to 2025, difficult though that might be, ready to share a visionary time travel report with us. So can you give us a summary from that report, the executive summary? What did you see, hear and feel in that flourishing 2040? What stood out for you and really stayed with you?
Well, what affected me, there were two things that affected me. First of all, how peaceful it was. You feel, look, it's almost like when you go camping, you feel the rhythms of nature, you feel the rhythms of the earth. You feel connected to nature, but that exists on more of a civilization-wide scale or a socially wide scale. It's the society runs more at that pace rather than it runs at the pace that we have now of our own psychological whims and needs and ideas. And I, from my experience just birding and being in nature, I get that from time to time anyway. So that part of it wasn't a shock to me. Seeing it so widespread on a socially wide scale was shocking. But then the thing that was really interesting was, how did they get there? From here to there, what did they actually do to get to that state? And honestly, I kind of found that a little bit more, and what it took to achieve that surprised me more than the actual end result. And so what it took to achieve that was to basically realise that you've got to take responsibility for your own life and this planet's and your society's well-being. Don't leave it up to leaders. And what happened through the late 2020s and 2030s was society devolved from a hierarchy into more of a localised economies, localised trading, based more, I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of Dunbar's number, and there's a cognitive limit to how many people we can maintain stable or meaningful relationships with. Our economic practice was brought down into that. And so we're dealing, the people in the future society were dealing more with people that they knew on a day-to-day basis rather than the anonymity of being in a much larger hierarchy. And I think what brought all of this on, and it's interesting because there's such a strong parallel with biological systems, that state-based capitalism and state-based socialism got to a point where the hierarchies were so rich and they were screwing so much out of the middle and lower class that the bulk of the population just realized that they had to look after themselves. And by developing economies without money, by trading and freely giving things, gift economies, they basically cut the legs out from the top of the hierarchy and they rebuilt a society from the ground up rather than expecting leaders to do it for them. And that surprised me more because it's exactly what we need and how we need to get to. We're not going to have a peaceful, environmentally sustainable world unless we do stuff like that, because the environmental cost and the social costs and the psychological damage of maintaining a top-heavy, exploitative hierarchy that we have now, and I don't care whether it's capitalism or state-based socialism, it's there. There are power elites that we're contributing to by virtue of the economy we're in. So people basically reinvented an economy on a human level, and the world and themselves are so much better for it. And the fact that happened in the 2030s was amazing.
Fantastic. And we will come back to that very point about how we got there in the next section there in terms of signals of the future. But thanks for sharing those impressions of an imagined 2040. This is an example of exercising future vision imagination, not just for entertainment, nothing wrong with that, but in this case to create neither a utopia or a dystopian fantasy, but rather to help craft a credible vision of possible better futures grounded in professional expertise, lived experience, and a strong public desire, and it's very widespread as revealed by many, many surveys, to achieve improved development pathways which can safeguard the well-being of the generations to follow. And in this series, we want to explore an intriguing question using the podcast medium. What if many more everyday citizens could imagine and visualize the sort of plausible, flourishing futures you're pointing to there? Could an increase in the use of such public imagination help achieve those futures more likely? For instance, what could happen if enough people in our region sought answers to an imaginative question like, what if we created empowered, citizen-led development review panels focused on achieving a responsible, evidence-based balance between the needs for infrastructure development and a respected, protected place for nature by 2040 and beyond? Let's just do a quick debrief, Scott, because time travel can be, very overexciting, a bit fatiguing here. I mean, some of my guests, they're a bit worse for wear when they get back to 2025. So let's do a quick check-in to confirm we're all safely back in 2025. Scott, what month and year is this?
It's November 27th, 2025. There we go. I got the right one.
Brilliant. Look, you set the dial, got the dial back to the right and the right marks. That's great. And let's stay grounded in the present as we and our listeners explore another way to imagine flourishing futures. And we've already started to point to this, in effect, by noticing what's already happening or emerging right now. Because sometimes we will hear reports of innovative new technologies or progressive case studies on how to do development differently, or we'll read about promising new forms of citizen-led development decision-making, or the creation of well-being focused economies. Such genuinely bold, fresh ideas on how we could move forward in better ways are, in effect, you can think of these as pathway markers or signals of better futures to come. And it follows that if such signals were more greatly supported, amplified, multiplied and extended, they could perhaps increase our chances of achieving those genuinely flourishing futures. Such signals can perhaps give us a glimpse of the kind of better world many of us would like to see in 10, 15 or 20 years and beyond. And to be clear, these signals of the future aren't fantasies from utopia, they're real initiatives that are happening now. So, Scott, in your own recent nature protection advocacy work, have you noticed some of these promising signals of the future? And if so, can you give us a bit of a description there? Initiatives, ideas, proofs of concepts that have grabbed your attention?
Yeah, well, the Toowoomba Regional Council is trying to do this, but I reserve, let's not say skepticism. I just think there's inherently going to be a limit to how effective it is. And so the couple of things that I'm thinking of is they are talking about getting a community reference group to advise on the new planning scheme, which is a great idea. But, you know, having been around the ridges and having worked for government a bit as well, yeah, I'm aware of box ticking exercises and the ability to look and sound and, seem like you're doing the right thing, but then it's all about the follow through afterwards and how committed are they. And although I do welcome this idea of having a community reference group, and I would certainly like to be part of it. Another thing that they've started doing is partnering with community members to plant trees on the nature strip. But again, things like that and offset plantings are seen as a bit of a get out of jail free card to enable you to then go and bulldoze a whole lot of trees because we're planting these other ones and we're working with the community. And so although there are some positives with this, I think what's really needed is a deeper structural change. And, that's why I think it's really important that we take our own responsibility to start with, for our own well-being, for our community's well-being, and we try and extract less resources from the planet, basically. I think one thing that's lacking in the whole discussion, both in economics and the public discourse, is the basic systems theory that if a system creates more outputs creates outputs that can't be ingested as inputs, that system's going to fail. And Earth is not an entirely closed system. It almost is, but we still rely on sunlight to power everything. But if you think of the biosphere and the atmosphere, we're creating so many outputs that aren't returning as inputs that eventually the biological systems are going to completely collapse and we're going to be part of it. And I think people just need to be aware of that in the choices they make. And, the answer is not in our government, unfortunately, certainly not in its current form. So, yes, there are some positive things happening, but I don't think it's going to solve it. What's going to solve it is people not following these leaders and taking responsibility themselves.
Yeah, very interesting there. I mean, again, a whole raft of points that you're making, which are circulating, in other discussions as well. I mean, this whole idea of trying to reinvigorate a genuine sense of local democracy, whereby citizens, local citizens actually do have an active, genuine, not a tokenistic role in helping make joint decisions in collaboration and partnership with government. I mean, this has been tried over the years in various parts of the world. But as you imply, there's always a risk that it simply becomes a box-ticking exercise, that the often very clever, profound, insightful suggestions of the public, who aren't stupid, as it turns out, who would have thought that, in terms of doing stuff that needs to be done as opposed to ticking boxes, then those public decisions, those citizen-suggested ideas aren't taken into account. They just fall on the floor of the committee room or whatever. Yeah. But it has been done. I mean, the history of citizen juries and citizen assemblies around the world, just quickly thinking of the example of Southern Ireland. I know it's a long, long way away, but, 10 years ago, Southern Ireland era in Europe, they put decisions, very profound decisions, same-sex marriage, abortion rights and stuff like this over to a citizen panel. And basically the government followed through on implementing the very liberal recommendations of those panels, which were very progressive. So it can be done, it has been done, but as you say, there's always that risk that, it becomes a tokenistic exercise. The other point you make, which I think is extremely valuable, is the system level approach, the bigger picture approach, going upstream to what really matters in terms of underpinning human health and well-being. And it's not the economy. The economy is an invention of the human mind. What really underpins all of our health and well-being is the natural world, ultimately, a safe, stable climate and a good biodiverse natural world. But we seem to have forgotten that in terms of modern capitalist, neoliberal, economic rationalist capitalism. So, Scott, thanks very much again. That imaginative exercise on signals of the future could be helpful in accelerating our progress toward flourishing, properly nature-protected development pathways. You're pointing out there both the upside, but also the pushback, possible downside negativities, which again we'll come back to at the end of our discussion.
Oh, yeah.
But let's just imagine again, because this is a show about imagination for a moment, how this could happen in practice. What if, again, these magical what if questions, what if our listeners and other citizens out there, they started to actively spot their own signals of the future, pointers to better ways of doing development, and what if in growing alliance those same citizens demanded stronger political action to help multiply and extend those signal initiatives? So, for instance, instead of tokenism from local government, let's have some real action in terms of a committee or an assembly or whatever you want to call it of local citizens that actually have some teeth, that they're empowered to make recommendations to government, which is actually actively acted upon and implemented. So now, Scott, look, as we near the end of today's marvellous conversation, let's return to reinforce your inspiring vision of a proper place for nature in southeast Queensland by 2040, because, as we all know, and we've been talking about this, here in 2025, such visionary and progressive ideas are far too often dismissed as idealistic, unrealistic, unaffordable, or some other knee-jerk criticism. And the theme of pushback is explored again in our introductory episode, which considers how the propaganda, let's call it for what it is, of vested interests, all too often skew development debates toward their own self-serving agendas. This podcast aims to help counter that power of self-serving can't-do, business-as-usual mindsets by inviting the public to become inspired by bold alternative visions of better futures. And one of our own visions for this podcast is to grow a community of listeners who use their imaginations to help co-create inclusive, community-led future development roadmaps and push assertively for their adoption. By trying to expand the use of public future vision imagination and associated citizen political advocacy, we hope to generate our own future vision signal for a truly democratic future, a future in which citizen-led collaborative decision-making becomes central to helping achieve genuine flourishing development outcomes for all. So, Scott, in the light of that ringing endorsement of the value of assertive future vision imagination, let's start to round off this thought-provoking, great discussion and come to our last imaginative question and exercise of the interview. This one showcases the imaginative idea of taking unlimited assertive actions to achieve flourishing futures. You started to point to this in terms of the pushback stuff you were just talking about. But in this case, this exercise follows this idea that, vested interests cannot push back against your choice of actions. So, Scott, imagine you wake up tomorrow and discover you've gained a wonderful power shared with many other imaginative allies. So this is not a if I ruled the world approach. This power allows you to enact visionary but well-considered collaborative reforms that benefit all of our human and more than human communities, that is nature and other species. And these reforms in our imagination cannot be blocked by vested interest. Just imagine that. And in this imagination scenario, what are one or more actions that you take immediately to help steer us toward the goal of achieving a well-protected, respected place for nature in southeast Queensland by 2040 and beyond?
Yeah, well, that's a hard one because you're working in an environment which is based on the exact opposite. So your room to move is pretty small, but nonetheless, it's about connecting with people. You've got to start with the already converted. You don't want to, people who don't understand the need for this, don't try and connect with them yet. I think it's about, like I was saying before, devolving into smaller economic units, developing really strong social relationships and bringing in a micro trading environment within these smaller economic units and then between them, so that the wealth is basically moved laterally rather than vertically. The big problem we have with profits in capitalism or just straight out power imbalances in state-based socialism is wealth gets moved to the top instead of laterally across the people. And the more that we can do outside of the prevailing economic structures, the more we're empowering ourselves and bringing those at the top of those structures down to our level. And as that kind of system starts to function successfully, then others will be, who aren't convinced, they'll start to be convinced and come on board. So what I'm saying is start to connect with like-minded people and start to find ways to help and support each other outside of our economy, no matter what country you're in now, outside of your prevailing greater economy. Step out of the mainstream and start to connect with other people as human beings and find ways to support each other there.
Some great ideas again there, Scott. Interestingly, it seems, we've talked, and it's not surprising because it's absolutely essential to everything that's done in this modern world, is the economy. And a lot of the stuff you've been talking about there, slower pace, more nature connected, living within the sort of boundaries imposed by the natural world instead of destroying them, more inclusive and supportive. A lot of this stuff is really being pushed by the well-being economy models that are coming out in Australia and internationally. I'm going to put some links to the fantastic work of, for instance, The Next Economy, which is an imaginative advocacy organisation that's been doing the rounds in Australia for over 10 years now. Brilliant report on how we can create a well-being economy that is focused on human well-being, not on profit and loss primarily. So it's all doable. All of this stuff is doable. This is a great thing, and we're talking about it now. Scott, amazing, inspiring ideas, great stuff. Once again, so energizing to experience the use of imagination in its ability to point us towards actions which could help us achieve better can-do futures. Certainly more inspiring than listening to a long, turgid list of business-as-usual reasons as to why we can't do future development in genuinely progressive ways. But look, now for the absolute last question of this great interview for you, Scott, I promise. Do you have any parting words of wisdom for our audience? A short or even long, comment perhaps, which summarises or adds to the core messages that you've been putting across so well today. And perhaps also a suggestion for how listeners could get more deeply involved with the ideas and initiatives that we've been talking about today. Whatever you want to say in closing, Scott.
I'm reminded years ago, 30 odd years ago, I was living in Sydney for a couple of years. And I and two of my housemates were talking, and one guy, Matt Ellery, we were talking about this very topic. So this is probably about 96 or 95, thereabouts. And he summed it up perfectly. He said, it's only people with the skill, by definition, it's only the people with the skills to live together who are going to be able to survive, because everything else by its very nature is destructive. And, it's both a big picture and a highly realistic, specific thing in the here and now, that there's not going to be anything sustainable if it's not harmonious. If it's not harmonious with each other, or if it's not harmonious with nature, because anything else is just conflict and by its nature destructive. And, we have these world leaders and these business leaders who are just spinning this absolute lie that their path is the correct one and their path is going to be sustainable. And it's not. What they're doing is maintaining their own self-interest. And, you until they die, basically, living a really nice life until they die. And so what levers do we have? We've only got three that I can think of off the top of my head. That the first one with the political thing is, if you can show them that there's no votes in that particular outlook, or that they're going to lose their job by maintaining that outlook, if you can change the public opinion underneath them, then they're going to change as well, or else they're going to get voted out. You've got that. And then you've got with businesses and housing developments, don't buy into housing developments where they do this scorched earth clearing. You've got a certain amount of power, I hate to say it, but as a consumer, as Devo said, use your freedom of choice, start to, to make some of your decisions based not on what's cheapest, but what is best for you and the environment and your society. But then, there's still, with both of those things, there's still a degree of, you're still reliant on someone else coming to the party or someone else changing. And the most important thing you can do, I think, yourself, is build a new and better system which doesn't require the approval or the assistance of someone already in power, whether they're a politician or a business person. And, using modern technology to link alternative economies, things like that is far more important than the first two examples. And, you've got to, I suppose I'm in the lucky position that I've got a bit of experience. I don't mind doing public talks and I don't mind doing videos and things. And it's great to be able to get the ideas out there, but you've got to do more than that. I think you've got to get your hands dirty and get involved and start to make these systems yourself. So it's about educating, but also about doing. And the best way to do is not to ask permission from people who aren't really that genuine anyway. It's just to go and do it. That's all I got to say.
No, it's great. I mean, again, several things that I just take off the top of my head out of that. Going back to some of your first comments, going back in time again, how long people have been looking forward, using imagination to better possible alternative futures, not just, you and your colleagues, you and your friends back in the 90s, by the sounds of it, not just accepting the status quo, but imagining a better world that, doesn't just follow a taken for granted path into the future. And people have always done that. I mean, I'm just struck by... I did environmental science back in the early 70s when that was still quite a novel, interdisciplinary environmental science, quite a novel thing to do. I remember a very seminal book that came out at the time in 1972. That just shows you how old I am. The Limits to Growth.
Oh, yeah,
and it's just passed its 50th anniversary with a new appraisal of this was one of the very first computer, for its time, amazing, computer-generated appraisals of where capitalism might take us in the future, based on a sort of assumed just total growth trajectory. And essentially it pointed to severe problems by the middle of the 21st century. This is back in 1972. Every single research project that's reappraised that or looked at again at the arguments of limits to growth have come up with the same view that is bang on. It's bang on in its prediction. So the writing was on the wall for the sort of problems that we're facing now 50 plus years ago. And the fact that we have not... what strikes me, the fact that we didn't take that story on board shows the power of other stories. And what you've been talking about there, unfortunately, the power of stories, whether they're truthful or even delusional, to influence people. And if enough people get behind a story, whether it's, economic growth or whether it's top-down power or whatever it is, unfortunately, if enough people, it gets into enough people's heads, it can be highly influential. And so, this podcast series is an attempt to get other stories into people's heads. But look, fantastic work there and fantastic insights, Scott. Wonderful way to round off today's conversation. You've shared such thoughtful, energising, thought-provoking ideas about the kinds of development pathways we could take to help achieve a proper and respected place for nature and better economic development generally, and the human well-being which is so dependent upon it in southeast Queensland by 2040 and beyond. But I do think also that many of the ideas we've been talking about today are as applicable to the rest of Australia and frankly internationally as they are to the southeast corner of Queensland. But you've certainly given me, and I'm sure our listeners, plenty to take away and reflect upon. So, Scott, on behalf of Householders Options to Protect the Environment, that is Hope Incorporated Australia, thank you so much for the time you've devoted to this interview.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Andy. Thanks for having me on. And I look forward to catching up with you another time and having a chat on or off podcasts. It'd be good.
It was great to talk with Scott today, and I'm going to take away several stimulating ideas from our conversation. Firstly, I liked that he added to an idea that other recent guests have also put forward in our episodes on nature protection, and that is the idea that we are part of nature, not separate from it, and that it follows that the health and well-being of we humans depends strongly on the health and well-being of nature and the natural systems that keep the planet functioning. And therefore, we should do a better job of looking after those natural systems in our own future self-interest and in the interests of following generations. It was also great to hear Scott being stimulated by the episode Future Vision Imagination Questions to ask himself how his preferable future world could be brought about and to start to think aloud about the options. This is the very sort of future vision process we have been hoping to model in the podcast series. And finally, there were Scot's own ideas on how his imaginary future region could possibly be achieved. His vision for the greater self-reliance of people, organised into smaller community groups, with more localised democracy and decision-making and more localised exchange of goods. That idea is in line with some of the new thinking coming from around the world on how to better organise future economies and forms of development. So that's what I'll be taking away from the conversation. But what about you, our audience, our growing community of visionary thinkers? What will you take from today's imaginative conversation? Each of our episodes invites you to join this experiment in future visioning, to perhaps help us answer the imaginative question: what if a podcast like this could help spark the shift we need towards more just, sustainable development pathways? What if more citizens harnessed their imaginations to map out preferable, credible futures and advocated politically to make them real? Only time will tell if we can answer such questions, but meanwhile we hope this episode inspires your own imaginative conversations in homes, workplaces, communities and beyond. You might ask yourself, what could a flourishing 2040 look like for you and those around you? Or how might our imaginative podcast exercises, time travel, signals of the future and bold actions help you reflect and communicate your hopes? And if you're enjoying the series, please share it. For instance, word of mouth helps grow our audience and build a community committed to flourishing futures. And we'd love to hear from you. What resonated or challenged you? You can send your thoughts via email, social media or voice message using the details in the show notes and on the Hope Incorporated Australia website. Suggestions for future guests, topics or format improvements are always welcome. This podcast is a collaborative journey and your input helps shape what comes next. So until next time, keep your imaginations alive, keep wearing your flourishing futures hats, and keep sharing ideas about how, together, we can reimagine development toward a thriving 2040 and beyond. My name is Andrew Nicholson, host of Imagining 2040, and thanks so much for listening. Hope Incorporated Australia, providing podcasts, research and community educational outreach to help achieve our vision of a society which is sustainable and just, ecologically, socially and economically. For more details on our work, please visit our website at www.hopeaustralia.org.au.